You wake up, check your phone, make coffee, and leave for work. Everything feels completely normal, but somewhere inside an EFB field office, your name has just entered a federal investigation. You don't know it yet. No agents are outside your house. No black SUVs are following you. Your phone hasn't suddenly started flashing warnings. From your perspective, nothing has changed. But behind the scenes, a process has begun that could eventually put federal agents at your door. And contrary to what movies suggest, it usually doesn't begin with a room full of agents staring at your photograph on a giant screen. It can begin with something much smaller. A tip from the public, information from another investigation, evidence collected by local police, a witness statement, records obtained through lawful process, or information passed from another law enforcement agency. At first, your name may be only one piece of a much larger puzzle.
The FBI receives enormous amounts of information, and simply appearing in a tip or being mentioned in an investigation does not automatically make someone guilty or even mean agents will open a full investigation. Information has to be evaluated. Agents and analysts need to determine what it actually means, whether it is credible, whether it relates to a potential federal crime or national security matter within FBI jurisdiction, and whether there is a lawful basis for further investigative activity. Imagine that investigators are already examining a serious federal crime. They have reports, interviews, documents, physical evidence, and other information coming from different places. Somewhere inside all of that, your name appears. Maybe a witness mentioned you. Maybe your name appears in records connected to the investigation. Maybe another police department sends information that investigators believe could be relevant. One clue by itself may mean very little.
The important question is whether it connects to anything else. This is where the real process looks very different from television. Investigators are not supposed to simply decide that someone looks guilty and then hunt for proof. They document information, compare evidence, conduct interviews, review records they are legally authorized to obtain, and follow investigative procedures. Depending on the circumstances and what investigators want to access, additional legal process such as subpoenas, court orders, or search warrants may be required, and those powers are not interchangeable. A search warrant, for example, generally requires probable cause and judicial authorization. So while you continue going through an ordinary day, the investigation may still be almost invisible. At an FBI field office, an agent could be reading a report containing your name. Somewhere else, an analyst could be reviewing information connected to the broader case. Local police may have evidence from an earlier incident. Prosecutors may become involved as investigators consider legal steps. Nobody needs to contact you immediately. In fact, at this stage, investigators may still be trying to answer a much more basic question. Who are you, and what, if anything, is your connection to the case? They may discover that the information leads nowhere. A witness could be mistaken. Two people could share the same name. A suspicious-looking connection could have an innocent explanation. Evidence can exclude people just as it can implicate them. That matters because being investigated is not the same as being charged, and being charged is not the same as being convicted. But imagine the opposite happens. The information does not disappear. Instead, additional evidence begins pointing in the same direction. One record connects to another. A witness provides relevant information. Investigators establish that the person they are looking at really is you. What started as a name buried inside a report is becoming something more serious. You still might have no idea. You could be buying groceries, sitting at work, driving home, or watching television, while people you have never met are assembling a timeline of events connected to an investigation. But even now, the FBI cannot simply do anything at once. Different investigative techniques have different legal requirements, internal rules, and levels of authorization. The more intrusive the step, the more important those boundaries become. Eventually, investigators may reach a point where they believe there is enough reason to move forward. Your name is no longer just something they encountered. You have become relevant to the case. And now the question changes. It is no longer simply, who is this person? It becomes, what does the evidence actually show? That is when the investigation starts getting much deeper.
Because in the next stage, agents begin assembling the case piece by piece and every interview, record, camera image, document, and legally obtained digital clue can become part of a much larger picture. By the time the investigation reaches this stage, your name is no longer just sitting inside a report. Investigators now have a reason to look deeper, but they still do not know the entire story. They may have fragments, a witness statement, a document, a camera image, a record connected to the case, or evidence collected somewhere else. None of those pieces necessarily proves anything by itself. The next job is to find out whether they actually fit together. And this is where an investigation can begin to grow around you without you ever realizing it. While you go to work, meet friends, buy groceries, and return home, agents and analysts may be reconstructing events connected to the case. They build timelines, they compare statements, they examine physical evidence.
They review records they are legally authorized to obtain. They may interview people who witnessed relevant events or know something about the circumstances being investigated. Every new piece is compared against what they already know. If two sources contradict each other, investigators need to understand why. If a witness remembers something differently from what a camera shows, that discrepancy matters. If a document places someone somewhere different from what investigators expected, the theory may have to change. Real investigations are rarely a perfect straight line. Leads fail, witnesses make mistakes, information turns out to be irrelevant. Investigators can spend days following something that ultimately leads nowhere. But sometimes, a new piece of evidence connects with something that was already sitting in the case file. A location matches, a date makes sense, a photograph supports part of a witness statement. Another record independently points toward the same event. Slowly, the picture becomes clearer. Digital evidence can also become important, but not in the magical way movies often portray it. There is no single computer where an agent types your name and instantly sees your entire life. Different information exists in different places, and access can require different legal processes depending on what investigators are seeking. Investigators may examine lawfully obtained device data, relevant online records, photographs, videos, communications, or other digital material connected to a case. Specialists can help preserve and analyze digital evidence so investigators can understand what it actually shows. But collecting information is only half the job. They also need to prove that the information is reliable and connected to the right person. A photograph without context can be misleading. A name can belong to multiple people. A device can be used by more than one person. A timestamp may need explanation. This is why investigators try to corroborate important facts using multiple sources rather than relying on one dramatic clue. And as the case becomes more serious, prosecutors may work with investigators to evaluate evidence and determine what legal steps are appropriate. If investigators want to conduct a search that requires a warrant, they generally need to establish probable cause and present supporting facts to a judge. The judge, not the FBI, decides whether the legal standard for that warrant has been met. If authorization is granted, investigators may then be able to search a specific place or obtain particular evidence within the scope of that warrant. Imagine that happens in our case. A new piece of evidence is obtained legally and added to the growing file. Investigators compare it with earlier interviews, records, photographs, and physical evidence. Something matches. Then another piece matches. The investigation that once contained dozens of possibilities begins narrowing.
Your photograph appears more often in briefings. Your name appears in more relevant parts of the case file. But even now, that does not mean guilt has been established. Investigators are building evidence. Guilt is ultimately determined through the judicial process. Still, from your perspective, the strangest part is that life may look exactly the same. You wake up in the same bed, you drive the same route to work, you eat at the same restaurants, you speak to the same people. You may have absolutely no idea that somewhere else, a conference room is filling with information connected to events investigators are trying to understand. Then the case changes again. Investigators reach a point where they are no longer asking whether your name is relevant. The evidence has become significant enough that they need to determine what happens next. Perhaps more investigation is required. Perhaps prosecutors need to review the case. Perhaps investigators believe there is probable cause to seek an arrest warrant, which must go through the appropriate legal process. And if a warrant is eventually issued and authorities discover that you are no longer where they expected you to be, the entire nature of the investigation changes. The people building the case now have a new problem. Before they can take the next step, they have to find you. The case is built. Investigators believe they know who they are looking for. But now they have a completely different problem. They need to find you. Maybe authorities go to the address they expected you to be at and discover you are no longer there. Maybe an arrest warrant has been issued through the appropriate legal process, but nobody knows exactly where you are. From that moment, the investigation changes. The evidence still matters, but now location becomes the central question. And this is where a federal manhunt can begin. Movies make this look almost supernatural. An agent types a name into a computer. Satellites appear on a giant screen, and seconds later, a flashing red dot reveals exactly where the fugitive is standing. Real investigations are far less magical. There is no universal screen showing the live location of every person in America. Instead, investigators work with leads. They verify information, coordinate with other law enforcement agencies, conduct interviews, review legally available or lawfully obtained records relevant to the investigation, and try to separate useful information from noise. One of the first challenges is surprisingly basic, confirming that the person being reported is actually the person they are looking for. A witness might call and say they saw someone who looks similar. A local officer might encounter someone with the same name. A photograph circulating online might be old. Investigators cannot assume every sighting is correct. Each promising lead has to be evaluated. Meanwhile, the search can expand far beyond the FBI office where the case began. The FBI operates field offices across the United States, and federal investigations can involve cooperation with state and local police, other federal agencies, and, when appropriate, international partners. If information suggests a wanted person may be somewhere else, investigators do not necessarily have to start the entire case again from zero. Relevant information can be coordinated with law enforcement in another jurisdiction. Imagine that a tip arrives from hundreds of miles away. Someone believes they saw the wanted person. At first, it is only a possibility. Investigators compare the information with what they already know. Does the description make sense? Is the timing plausible? Is there anything that independently supports the report? A team may discover that the person in the tip is completely unrelated. That lead dies. Then another arrives. Again, it has to be checked. This can happen repeatedly. A manhunt is not one perfect trail. It can be dozens or hundreds of possibilities, most of which lead nowhere. And behind the agents in the field, analysts can be helping organize the growing amount of information. Reports arrive. Tips are documented. Connections are compared. Relevant evidence from the existing case is reviewed alongside new information. The goal is not to predict the future. It is to reduce uncertainty. Every verified fact can make the search area a little smaller, but there is also a legal boundary around what investigators can do. The existence of an arrest warrant does not automatically give authorities unlimited power to search anywhere, access any information, or enter any property under any circumstances. Different investigative actions can require different legal authority, and operational decisions depend on the facts of the case.
That part is less dramatic than television, but it is essential to understanding how a real investigation works. Then imagine one lead survives the first checks. It is not proof yet, but unlike the others, it begins matching information already known to investigators. Another piece of information points toward the same general area. Local law enforcement is contacted. The information is checked again. For the first time, investigators may have a credible idea of where the wanted person could be. But knowing a general area and knowing exactly where someone is are very different things. Investigators still need confidence that they have the correct person and that the information is current. A mistake at this stage could involve an innocent person or send resources to the wrong place. So the work continues. More information arrives. Another lead is eliminated. Another is confirmed. The search that once covered multiple possibilities begins to narrow. And while all of this is happening, the person being sought may have no idea which leads investigators are following, which reports have been rejected, or how close the search has become. Then, a new piece of information arrives. This time, it does not point to an entire state or city. It points toward a much smaller area. Investigators compare it with the case. Several details line up. The lead is considered credible enough to receive serious attention. The people who spent days or weeks asking, "Where is he?" may finally have something they can act on. But finding a possible location is not the same as making an arrest. Before anyone moves in, authorities have to think about something else entirely. What happens when they actually reach him? And that is when the search becomes an operation. The search has finally narrowed. Investigators no longer believe you could be anywhere in the country. Several pieces of information now point toward the same general area.
But this is also where the manhunt becomes more complicated. Finding a city is not the same as finding a person. A single neighborhood can contain thousands of apartments, houses, businesses, hotels, parking lots, and people who have nothing to do with the case. Investigators still need to confirm that the person they are looking for is actually there. A mistake now could send officers to the wrong location or involve someone completely innocent. So instead of immediately rushing in, the information is checked again. Federal agents coordinate with local law enforcement. Existing evidence is compared with the new lead. Reports from the area are reviewed. Investigators try to determine whether independent pieces of information support the same conclusion. And while that happens, the scale of the operation can begin to grow. The FBI office that opened the original investigation may no longer be the only team involved. Agents in another field office can become part of the effort. Local police may provide knowledge of the area. Other federal agencies may become involved when their authorities or resources are relevant. If the search crosses national borders, cooperation can extend to foreign law enforcement partners through established legal and diplomatic channels. A person can move between jurisdictions, but the case does not simply disappear when they cross an invisible line on a map. Information can move too. This is one reason major fugitive investigations can look so different behind the scenes from what the public sees. To the public, there may be one photograph and one name. Behind that photograph can be investigators, analysts, prosecutors, local officers, dispatchers, forensic specialists, and other personnel working on different parts of the same problem. And sometimes the public itself becomes part of the search. In appropriate cases, law enforcement may release a wanted poster, photographs, identifying information, or a request for tips.
Some fugitives may receive much wider publicity, and certain cases can include rewards for information leading to an arrest. Suddenly, millions of people can potentially see the same face investigators have been studying for weeks. Tips begin arriving. Someone thinks they saw the person at a restaurant. Someone else remembers a customer at a motel. Another caller is absolutely certain they saw the fugitive hundreds of miles away. Most of those reports may be wrong. Some may be misunderstandings. Others may be completely unrelated. Every new tip creates another question that has to be evaluated without allowing bad information to overwhelm the investigation. But occasionally, one tip contains something different. Maybe it aligns with information investigators already have. Maybe several independent facts point toward the same general place. No single detail necessarily solves the case, but together they can make one possibility much stronger than the others. The search begins narrowing again. A broad region becomes a city becomes a smaller area. Investigators continue working to confirm that they have the right person and current information. At the same time, authorities have to think about what happens if they actually encounter the fugitive. They do not know exactly how the person will react. They may need to consider the alleged offense, known risks, the environment, the presence of uninvolved people, and the legal authority under which they are operating. The goal is not to create the most dramatic arrest possible. The goal is to carry out lawful enforcement while managing risk to officers, the public, and the person being arrested. This is where planning becomes increasingly important. Investigators and supervisors review what is known. Responsibilities are coordinated. Local agencies may be briefed. Emergency contingencies can be considered.
If specialized personnel are appropriate because of the circumstances, decisions about their involvement are made by the agencies responsible for the operation. But before any arrest can happen, investigators still need confidence that the person at the center of all this work is actually where they believe them to be. Then something changes. Another piece of information arrives, and this time it supports the strongest existing lead. Investigators compare it with everything accumulated during the search. The pieces line up closely enough that the atmosphere in the room changes. Phones start ringing. Supervisors are updated. Local law enforcement is contacted. People who have spent days or weeks sorting through dead ends suddenly have a reason to prepare for the possibility that the search is approaching its end. Somewhere nearby, however, the wanted person may still be going through an ordinary day, eating dinner, sitting inside a room, walking through a parking lot.
Watching television, they may have no idea that a search spanning multiple offices and agencies has gradually narrowed toward their location. The distance between investigators and the person they are looking for is no longer hundreds of miles. It may now be only a few miles, but those final miles can be the most important part of the entire manhunt, because knowing where someone may be is one thing. Approaching that location and making a lawful arrest safely is another. And now, for the first time since the search began, investigators are preparing to stop looking and start moving. The search is almost over. After days or weeks of reports, interviews, dead ends, and false sightings, investigators finally believe they know where you are. But this is the moment when everything becomes more dangerous. Finding a possible location is one thing. Making an arrest is something completely different. Before anyone approaches, investigators need to think about the situation they may be walking into. Who is believed to be inside? Are there other people nearby? What legal authority do officers have? What risks are known from the investigation? Could innocent residents, employees, or bystanders be present? The answers can affect how authorities prepare. The goal is not to create the dramatic raid you see in movies. It is to make a lawful arrest while reducing unnecessary risk to everyone involved. Somewhere inside a regional command center, supervisors review what investigators know. The arrest warrant and other relevant legal authority are confirmed. Information from the case is checked again. Local law enforcement may be briefed because they understand the area and may already be involved in the search. If the circumstances justify specialized personnel or additional resources, agencies decide what support is appropriate.
Meanwhile, the person at the center of the entire operation may still have no idea how close investigators have become. Imagine you are sitting inside a motel room. The television is playing quietly. Half-finished food sits on a table. Your phone is beside you. Outside, cars pass on the highway just like they have all evening. From inside that room, nothing seems different. But miles away, investigators are preparing for the possibility that this is the night the search ends. Even now, however, they still need to be sure. Acting on incorrect information could put an innocent person in danger, so investigators continue evaluating what they know and coordinating the response. A credible lead is not treated like magic proof. Identification matters. Current information matters. The environment matters. And then the operation begins. Personnel move toward the area according to the plan developed by the responsible agencies. Communications are coordinated. Supervisors remain informed. Depending on the circumstances, local officers or other law enforcement personnel may be involved. There may be no sirens and no dramatic convoy announcing what is happening. To most people nearby, it could look like an ordinary night. A driver stops for fuel. Someone walks out of a restaurant. A family returns home. Somewhere among all of them, a federal operation is unfolding. Then comes the moment investigators have been working toward. Authorities encounter the person they believe is the subject of the warrant and confirm the person's identity. What happens next depends heavily on the circumstances. Some arrests end with little drama. A person follows instructions, is taken into custody, and the operation is over within minutes. Other situations can involve greater risk and require a different response. There is no single arrest scene that represents every FBI case, but one principle remains the same. An arrest is not supposed to be punishment.
It is the act of taking someone into legal custody. The allegations still have to move through the justice system. Imagine that in our case, the wanted man realizes that law enforcement has arrived. For weeks, he existed mostly as a photograph on briefing boards, a name inside reports, and a question investigators kept asking: where is he? Now, for the first time, the people searching for him are in the same place. Officers identify themselves and give commands. The man complies. He is secured and placed under arrest. The search that stretched across offices, agencies, cities, and hundreds of pieces of information ends in a moment that may be surprisingly quiet. There is no dramatic music. No detective delivers a perfect final speech. There may simply be the sound of radios, traffic in the distance, and officers confirming that the person is in custody. But the work does not stop there. Authorities document the arrest. The person's identity is formally confirmed.
Property or evidence handled during the process must be dealt with according to applicable procedures and legal authority. Investigators notify the people responsible for the case that the fugitive has been located. Somewhere in the command center, the wanted person's photograph that dominated the investigation for days or weeks is no longer attached to an unanswered question. The question, "Where is he?" finally has an answer. And for the person being arrested, everything changes almost instantly. Minutes earlier, he may have been sitting in a room, eating dinner, or looking at his phone. Now he is in federal custody, surrounded by people who may have spent weeks trying to find him. He may be transported to an appropriate detention or processing location. The investigators who built the case may still have reports to complete, evidence to process, and prosecutors to update. But the manhunt itself is finished, or at least the search is.
Because being arrested is not the same as being convicted. The FBI does not decide whether the person is ultimately guilty. Investigators gather evidence and make arrests within the legal process. Prosecutors bring the government's case, defense counsel represents the accused, and courts determine what happens next. The person who spent weeks trying not to be found is about to enter a system where nearly every major step is documented, scheduled, and governed by legal procedure. The next time he sees the outside world may be through the window of a government vehicle on the way to a federal facility or courthouse. And when those doors close behind him, a completely different process begins. The manhunt is over, but the case is not. The moment the wanted man is taken into custody, the story moves from investigators searching across cities and states into a completely different system: federal court. And this part can begin surprisingly quickly. After the arrest, authorities first have to confirm exactly who they have taken into custody. Identity is documented, fingerprints may be taken, basic processing is completed, the arrest itself is recorded, and the agents involved begin completing reports about what happened. If property or evidence was lawfully collected during the arrest or an authorized search, it must be documented and handled according to established procedures. The man who spent weeks as a photograph on a briefing board is now physically inside the system. But there is something important to understand. Being arrested does not mean the FBI has decided that he is guilty. The FBI investigates. Agents gather evidence and make arrests when legally authorized. Prosecutors decide what charges to pursue on behalf of the government. Courts determine how the case moves forward, and guilt must ultimately be established through the legal process. That distinction becomes extremely important now. Imagine the arrested man sitting inside a secure federal holding area. A few hours earlier, he was watching television in a motel room. Now, his phone is gone. The door is locked, and every movement is controlled by procedure. Somewhere else, investigators are finishing reports, prosecutors are reviewing the case, court personnel are preparing for what comes next. For many federal defendants, one of the first major steps after arrest is an initial appearance before a federal magistrate judge. This generally happens without unnecessary delay. The courtroom may look far less dramatic than television. There may be no jury, no emotional witnesses, and no long opening statements. Instead, the judge deals with immediate legal issues. The defendant is informed of the charges or allegations involved. The court addresses the defendant's right to counsel. If the defendant cannot afford an attorney and qualifies, counsel can be appointed. Questions about custody and release may also begin to be addressed. Depending on the case, the government may argue that the defendant should remain detained while the case proceeds. The defense may argue for release under appropriate conditions. A judge considers the applicable law and relevant facts. The FBI does not simply decide, "We want him locked up until trial." Once the case enters court, decisions about detention are judicial decisions made through legal proceedings. And the person sitting at the defense table now has an attorney whose job is not to help investigators. The defense can challenge the government's case, examine evidence through the legal process, raise legal arguments, and protect the defendant's rights. This is where the story that looked so simple from the outside, FBI searches for fugitive, FBI finds fugitive, becomes much more complicated. Investigators may believe the evidence is strong. Prosecutors may believe they can prove the case.
But allegations still have to survive the justice system. Evidence can be challenged, witnesses can be questioned, legal disputes can arise over how evidence was obtained or whether it can be used. Facts that looked convincing during an investigation may be interpreted differently by the defense, and not every federal criminal case ends with a dramatic jury trial. Some cases are resolved through guilty pleas, others proceed through additional hearings and eventually to trial. Charges can change. Cases can involve negotiations, motions, additional investigation, and months or even years of legal proceedings. If the case does reach trial, the government's burden is not simply to show that investigators had a reason to suspect the defendant. Prosecutors must prove the charged offense beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense has the opportunity to challenge the evidence and present its case within the rules of the court.
A judge oversees the proceedings, and when there is a jury, jurors evaluate the evidence and determine whether the government has met its burden. Only then can the story reach the question that the EFB investigation could never answer by itself. Is this person legally guilty of the crime charged? If the defendant is acquitted, the government has failed to prove the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. If the defendant pleads guilty or is convicted, the case can move towards sentencing, where the court determines the appropriate sentence under the law and circumstances of the case. That could involve imprisonment, supervised release, fines, restitution, or other consequences depending on the offense and applicable law. And suddenly, that first moment from the beginning of our story looks very different. Remember the ordinary morning? The man woke up, checked his phone, made coffee, and went to work without knowing that his name had appeared inside a federal investigation. At that moment, he was simply one name among many pieces of information. Then, investigators checked the evidence. The case grew. Leads were eliminated. Others were confirmed. Eventually, authorities had legal grounds to move forward. Then, the man disappeared from where investigators expected him to be. The case became a search. The search expanded across jurisdictions. Tips arrived. Most went nowhere. A few began pointing in the same direction. A broad search became a smaller area. A smaller area became a credible location. And eventually, investigators arrived. What looked from the outside like a single arrest was actually the final visible moment of an enormous process that had been happening mostly out of sight. Analysts had reviewed information. Agents had conducted interviews. Local police had cooperated. Prosecutors had reviewed legal questions. Judges had made decisions where judicial authorization was required.
Dispatchers and support personnel had helped coordinate information, and after the arrest, another system took over. That is what really happens when the FBI starts looking for you. It is usually not one genius agent staring at a wall of photographs until everything suddenly makes sense. It is a process. Information is collected, claims are checked, evidence is compared, legal authority matters, mistakes have to be avoided. Hundreds of small decisions can eventually produce one very visible moment, a person being placed under arrest. And perhaps the strangest part is that for much of that process, the person at the center of it may see almost none of it happening. One morning, life feels completely normal. Somewhere else, their name appears inside a case file. Weeks or months later, they may be standing in a federal courtroom while a judge looks down from the bench. Between those two moments is an entire hidden world most people will never see.